Alright everybody, Ryomen Sukuna vs Akemura Soga. This is a matchup that's been a relatively recent discussion, and I can totally see why this matchup got as popular as it did. They are both considered the overall peaks of their verse in their time, they both have a familial connection with the protagonist, and most importantly, their power is portrayed as utterly terrifying in its destruction, yet divine in its artful execution. So let's talk about what would happen if they fought. The King of Curses against the Sword Saint. If these two shonen slashers went at it with all they had, who would come out on top? Well, I know everyone who has read both series probably has their own rather strong opinion on that. I've seen arguments go both ways about how one of them would totally stomp the other, but I do think it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, I've made plenty of JJK videos before, so I'm pretty sure my viewers are rather familiar with Sukuna's kit, but let's go over the basics anyway. Sukuna's curse technique is Shrine. His primary mode of attack is Dismantle, which lets him shoot out flying invisible slashes that are strong enough to damage some of the toughest sorcerers. There's also Cleave, which requires him to touch his target, but adjusts its power to the target's toughness. Now on their own, Cleave and Dismantle are not much of a threat to Akemura. Akemura is the wielder of the fabled Magatsumi, the most powerful enchanted blade to ever exist, and with it comes a host of abilities. Its first major ability is its manipulation over life energy or vitality. The moment he unsheathes the sword, it passively drains the vitality from every living thing in the vicinity, granting it to Akemura. This vitality then amps all of his physical stats, including regenerative ability. Now let's focus on that regen for a moment, because it's really no joke. Even someone wielding a small fraction of this power was able to heal quickly from deep cuts. Unfortunately, we have yet to see the limits of this healing factor because Akemura himself has yet to be meaningfully damaged. The most he got is this small cut, and then he actually started trying to win. The point is, Sukuna firing off dismantles is unlikely to be a solid win condition, and he would probably have a tough time landing Cleave as well. After all, Akemura can essentially fly, allowing him to keep his distance. Not to mention, there is also Centipede, which allows him to create powerful AoE shockwaves. So even with Sukuna being able to use the air itself as a foothold, it would be hard to get in close. Obviously, Akemura isn't invincible, and some of his attacks do have an interval between their usages, so if he's tricky about it, Sukuna absolutely can land some decent hits. My main point here is that Sukuna's main forms of attack are just not reliable win cons. The other difficulty that Akemura presents is something I already mentioned. When I said he can drain the life from anyone in his vicinity, that includes his opponents. This life drain is powerful enough to destroy the surrounding environment and even totally incapacitate sorcerers until their inevitable death. So let's talk about what Sukuna can even do about that. For one, Sukuna is quite powerful, which does seem to matter. After all, we see a tree basically disintegrate, and then we see sorcerers die slower than that. And I would say that Sukuna has more impressive showings than elite sorcerers in Kagurabachi. So even with no inherent defenses, he would still be faring better than we see in the series. On top of that, he also does have some counters. Now, the first thing that people would probably mention is Reverse Curse Technique, an ability that is most notable for its healing effects. Now, this definitely isn't the best option, as RCT burns through cursed energy rather quickly, but Sukuna's reserves are pretty massive, so it's not terrible and would allow him to fight normally for a short time. That being said, a much better option is Domain Amplification. Domain Amplification essentially surrounds the user in their innate domain, creating this empty space for whatever ability it comes into contact with to be poured in and negated. Now, Domain Amplification does have a limit. After all, we see Sukuna use it to counter Gojo's red, and even though it doesn't even take the full attack, damage still gets through. So Amplification is generally better for dealing with low output hacks abilities like Gojo's Infinity instead of higher output attacks. So where does that leave Akemura in this fight? I do think that Sukuna could stave off the basic life drain, but Akemura's other attacks are probably a different story. For example, Akemura has B, a large pointed boring attack that rips through over 300 meters of concrete, making a large hole in the ground. Now, is this as impressive as the more powerful attacks in JJK? Certainly not. Attacks like Divine Flame and Hollow Purple are definitely far more powerful just going off of destructive capacity. But I would argue Akemura's attacks do have better showings than Gojo's Red, so they should get through amplification. That all being said, this still leaves Sukuna in a decent position. I already mentioned the superiority of an attack like Hollow Purple, and Sukuna was just able to survive that. He took notable damage, sure, but with amplification on top of his durability, he should be fine tanking most of what Akemura can dish out. Bee, Centipede, and Dragonfly are not reliable forms of attack in my opinion. Now this all leaves us at a pretty interesting place in this conversation, because I think that both Sukuna and Akemura can pretty handily deal with each other's basic kits. Sukuna's normal mode of attack would probably be ineffective due to just having a tough time landing hits and those hits healing up instantly. This isn't even to mention that he can't fight normally while he's using domain amplification. Meanwhile, Akemura's general abilities would have a tough time getting through Sukuna's domain amplification and raw durability. I also think that domain amplification would probably allow Sukuna to negate the immobilizing power of Spider. Basically, this forces the both of them to fight a lot more seriously. So what happens when they really start bringing out the heavy hitter moves? This is where it gets kinda complicated, so I'll try to break things down as best I can. Starting with Sukuna, he has a few big attacks in his arsenal. The first one that most people are gonna bring up is the World-Cutting Slash, a dismantle that targets the fabric of space itself in order to cut through anything. Now I am bringing this one up first because I do think it is less of a factor than his other big attacks. What makes the World-Cutting Slash so deadly is that it's unblockable. Akemura is not going to be able to tank it in any way. But that's kinda the thing. I don't think that Akemura can really tank normal dismantle slashes. His advantage is that he can heal from those cuts. Sure, there is a chance that he takes a particularly lethal slash like Gojo did, but Akemura is very perceptive. Like when he countered Chihiro teleporting around him by reading the faint trace of spiritual energy before each teleportation. And we know that every curse technique produces a perceivable spark when used. So Akemura would have to be overwhelmed or caught off guard, and the slash itself would have to be well placed. On its own, the World-Cutting Slash isn't a great win condition. Although I will give him this, he should have no trouble using it. Akemura doesn't know to restrict his hands or ability to do chants, so Sukuna would be free to use it whenever he wants. Now that all being said, there is one way it might be able to secure a victory. While Akemura can heal from that damage, we have no evidence that his sword can do the same. If Sukuna uses the World-Cutting Slash to break the Magatsumi, it really doesn't matter how insanely durable it is, it will break. And while Akemura would be able to keep fighting temporarily, it really puts him in a tough spot that makes it a lot easier for Sukuna to win. But that's not his only win condition. For now, let's move on to his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine. Not only does this act as something of a power-up, but it also gets around Sukuna's biggest hassle, which is landing solid hits in the first place. Thousands of slashes with a sure hit effect that just appear on Akemura's body. And then on top of that, Sukuna can also use Divine Flame, a powerful thermobaric explosion that engulfed multiple city blocks and towered over high buildings. And it's not uncommon for Sukuna to use these abilities back to back. So that brings up the question, can Akemura deal with this? Well, what I think he can handle for sure is the heat from Divine Flame. During his battle with Samura, they were generating enough heat to melt the stone around them from just drawing their swords. And after that clash, he doesn't have any burns on him. This is despite the fact that his life drain was being countered, so he had no access to the physical buff or healing that it provides. So if he's fighting normally, without being nerfed, he should have a ridiculous amount of heat resistance, arguably in the thousands of degrees. The tricky part of this for Akemura, though, isn't the heat, it's the raw power. And that's because we don't really know how good his durability is or how strong his regeneration is. Earlier I said that the only time we see him damaged is against Chihiro with that small cut on his cheek, but that's not true. The only time we see him really damaged is when he's heavily nerfed against Samura. And when he isn't being nerfed and he has his healing, again, all he had was that small cut on his cheek. Now personally, I would argue that his healing should be good enough to handle Malevolent Shrine. We see that when Yura was fighting with a very small portion of the Shinichi's power, he was able to very quickly heal damage like lost limbs. Since Akemura's regeneration should be multiple times above that, you could make the argument that he could survive Malevolent Shrine. At least long enough to escape it, since it is an open domain with no barrier to trap him. Akemura just has to escape the 200-meter radius of the domain. The problem comes in with Divine Flame. Again, I think he'd take the heat of it no problem, but the force of the explosion on top of the barrage of slashes might genuinely be a solid win condition for Sukuna. Okay, so we do have a potential win here for Sukuna, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's not like Akemura is just gonna stand there and maybe die. He has a couple of big moves of his own. The first that anyone is going to bring up would be Butterfly. Now, I've been holding off on talking about it so far because it requires a lot of going into. Hokuzono uses a lot of flowery language when describing its powers, so there's a lot of discourse on exactly how it works. Let's get into that. It is primarily described and shown as a ranged attack that slashes through space with almost zero lag after it is swung. Now, the speed of this attack is a bit hard to parse, and people have a lot of different opinions. Some people say that it has no travel speed and acts more like a hit scan ability in a video game. Now, we know that isn't the case because later narration describes its speed racing through space. And while Chihiro uses some very grandiose language to describe how fast it is, it honestly doesn't actually say much beyond it being faster than he could conceivably react to. This speed is on top of the fact that its exact trajectory is completely unpredictable, especially the farther away a target is. Aside from all that though, what people argue about most is its space-cutting property. Basically, some people believe that it does not actually cut space, and the wording in the description instead refers to its ability to cut through that distance near instantly. And to be honest, I can see where this argument is coming from. Because when Chihiro talks about how deadly this attack is, he doesn't talk about it being unblockable or anything like that. He talks about its speed and unpredictability, which are unrelated to its cutting power. So the word space could just be referring to the area it cuts. Now, what do I think? Well, the first thing we need to look into is the word itself. We have to remember that we are reading a translation of a Japanese work. So when the manga says the word space, the actual word it's using is kukan. When we break it down, we have the character ku, which can translate to sky or emptiness, and the character kan, which can refer to an interval. From what I can tell, and obviously proficient speakers can correct me, the word itself is similarly flexible as the word space is in English, with it being able to refer to the physics concept of space or the idea of just a place. But let's be real for a second, because we're not just looking at a word, we're looking at a word in the context of a story. Hokuzono is very aware that he is writing a battle shonen manga. Manga like this have crazy powers, such as slashes that cut through space. We're talking about another guy who does that in this very video. I think that if Hokuzono wanted this ability to not cut through space like that, then he would have chosen a word that couldn't be misunderstood that way. Hey there, Editor Zenith here cutting in for a moment. So speaking of the world cutting slash, I decided to take a look at the Japanese for that as well, and when Sukuna describes how it can cut through space, Akutami uses the exact same word for space as Hokuzono uses for butterfly, so do with that what you will. Now, at the end of the day, that is still just my own opinion, and people can feel free to disagree. But let's move on and talk about what Sukuna can do about it. Real quick, before that though, I want to take a moment to credit @Kagurashiba on Twitter. They helped me get a look at the original Japanese for how Butterfly is described, and also break down some of the language that Hokuzono uses. Their Twitter account is great and goes into that stuff with every new chapter. I really recommend them if that interests you. Now, back to Sukuna. First off, I want to mention that if Butterfly can cut through space, then based on what Kusakabe said, domain amplification is useless against something like that. It would bypass it entirely. The real question is, would Sukuna be able to react to it? Which really isn't even a matter of speed. Yes, it's fast by the standards of Kagurabachi, but that's not the issue. What makes it so hard to dodge is that the trajectory of it becomes impossible to read. Now, Sukuna is able to read the occurrence of cursed energy before an attack comes out, and if we go off of Samura's Crow ability, then sorcery in Kagurabachi might have something similar. But that just says the ability is coming out, which, newsflash, Akemura says it is every time. The actual path of the slash is only read by this tiny disturbance in the air before it comes out. And the only person who has reacted to this is someone with downright superhuman vision. So I do want to give Sukuna credit. He could likely react to it in some way, but I don't think it would be with any level of precision to totally avoid damage. And if he gets done like Gojo, I mean, that just is a win for Akemura. Obviously, this is not the case if you reject the notion that it would cut through space and bypass Sukuna's amplification, but I'm going forward with the idea that it does, as I think that is the most reasonable explanation as of now. We will have to see more in the future. So let's move on and talk about Akemura's other big move. I already mentioned his sword's passive life drain ability. The Shinichi's true realm, the Malediction, seems to massively amplify this life drain, likely empowering him even further. This is not the big move that I'm talking about. I'm talking about his ability to focus all of that on a single person, making it several times stronger. Hell, considering he was able to kill thousands of people with the Malediction at once, you could argue that focusing it makes it thousands of times stronger. That is no longer a low output ability, and I just can't see domain amplification being able to protect against that. It would break through, weaken Sukuna, and feed that very life energy to Akemura. So where does that leave this fight? Let's review real quick. Both of them have arguably solid win conditions. On Sukuna's side, his first would be comboing Domain Expansion into Divine Flame, as he loves doing, and just obliterating the Sword Saint. He also has the World-Cutting Slash, which might not be a reliable win condition for killing Akemura himself, but could conceivably just break the Shinichi. On Akemura's side, he has his Targeted Malediction, which would heavily nerf Sukuna if not outright kill him. And he has Butterfly, which if it cuts through space, could end the fight just like that. Now I think Akemura would have a much easier time landing Butterfly than Sukuna would have landing a World-Cutting Slash, but that's offset by the unknown time interval between uses of Butterfly, so he would really have to make those hits count. The real problem that I'm coming to here is that none of these win conditions are particularly hard to pull off. I do think Sukuna would have to be a little tricky in order to break the Magatsumi, but that's about it. They can both possibly end the fight just by whipping out the big guns. So is this one of those videos where I kinda gotta say it goes either way? Is this the first video I do where I say it's a tie? Well, no. It really comes down to whoever goes for the win first. And that is a lot less about ability and more about character. I think you can see where this is going. Sukuna loves playing with his food. As long as he sees something vaguely special about an opponent, he will want to mess around and test their limits. Akemura is very different. He takes no joy in fighting, it's just a means of execution to him. If he believes he should kill someone, he does so without hesitation. This isn't readily apparent in the one fight we see him in because he doesn't want to kill his own nephew and instead tries to demoralize him. And the moment he comes to respect Chihiro's conviction, he ends the fight. And his fight with Samura was one where both his win conditions were actively countered. In any other situation, he is cold and ruthless. And in a fight where two characters have strong, easily accessible win conditions, I think that difference in attitude, well, makes a difference. Obviously, this is a matchup that is heavily up for debate. I'm not even particularly certain of every stance I took, and I was more trying to figure out the most likely outcome. So this is one of those fights where I'm really looking forward to what you all have to say in the comments below. I think there's a lot of fun stuff here that's up for debate. So let me know what you think. In the meantime, if you want more Kagurabachi and Jujutsu Kaisen content, feel free to stick around on the channel. Beyond that, make sure to take care and have a good one.